Snow didn't fall that day, it settled. Like the hush after a hymn. Like the way sorrow sits on a man's shoulders after too many winters alone. The train hissed as it came to its final stop, steam rising like breath from the dying. The platform groaned beneath boots, worn suitcases, the shuffle of those returning home or running from it. Harlan Graves stood with his gloved hands in his coat pockets, a man not waiting for anyone but weather. He hadn't planned to come into town, just meant to pick up an iron shipment, maybe salt, but something tugged. His horse had limped that morning. The wagon creaked in protest, its axle nearly splintering. And now, here he was, standing in snow that curled around his boots like old ghosts. He was about to turn back when he saw her. The girl couldn't have been more than 25, and even that felt generous. She stood stiff and small near the station's edge, her arms wrapped around herself in a thin traveling dress the color of faded magnolia, completely wrong for winter. Her boots were scuffed, worn, and soaked through. A bonnet barely clung to her head, hair like damp wheat sticking out beneath. But it was her eyes, clear, proud, afraid to be pitted, that rooted him. She was trying not to shiver. People passed her by. One porter offered to carry her bag, but she shook her head. There was no bag. No family. No gentleman tipping his hat to greet her. Just that dress. Just the cold. Just her standing there like she'd arrived in the wrong story and didn't know how to step back out. And that was when Harlan moved. Not because of kindness. Not because of gallantry. But because he remembered the ache of standing alone in the cold while the world decided it didn't need you anymore. He stepped up beside her without a word, removed his coat, heavy, wool, patched at the elbow, and placed it around her shoulders like a silent vow. Her eyes widened, startled. She opened her mouth, but nothing came. Then, slowly, she clutched the lapels of the coat like they were a prayer. The wind caught her hair just then, lifting strands against her cheek. He saw a bruise blooming under her jaw, yellowing like a faded petal. He didn't ask. Instead, he tipped his hat once, turned, and walked toward his wagon. She watched him go without a sound, without a thank you. And he didn't need one. From the porch of the inn, Mrs. Ellery Maycomb watched with a teacup paused mid-air. Her eyes were sharp as icicles. A widow's coat, she muttered to herself. What a curious thing to offer a stranger. Inside the general store, Deacon Holt, who'd seen more winters than he had teeth left, shook his head and said nothing. Just puffed on his pipe and watched the snow. Jean Whitlow stayed where she was, coat cinched tight. Her fingers trembled in the sleeves. Her breath came in fog. A man behind her muttered, "Should have brought a chaperone, miss." Another said, "Pretty face, shame about the rest." She didn't turn. She waited until the last of the crowd dispersed, then stepped off the platform toward the church. A place with a door. With warmth. With silence that might let her breathe. She passed the inn, ignoring Mrs. Maycomb's raised brows and pursed lips. She passed the saloon, where laughter cracked too loud for her thin bones. And when she reached the steps of the church, she sat, not inside, not knocking, just curled into herself beneath Harlan's coat, her back to the wind. Harlan rode home slow. His wagon creaked as it turned off the main road, the pine trees around his land whispering their dry secrets. His cabin stood solitary, smoke already gone from the chimney, fire long dead inside. He fed his horse, covered the wagon, and stepped into silence. His wife's picture was still on the mantel. Her dress was folded in a trunk he hadn't opened since she'd passed. But he didn't look at either. Not that night. He just sat by the window and stared out at the dark. The wind howled. He rubbed his hands together and realized his coat was gone. His shoulders felt bare without it. Not cold, exactly, just exposed. And still, something inside him was warm. Jean didn't sleep that night. Not properly. Not fully. But she drifted in and out on the steps of the church until Deacon Holt creaked open the door near dawn and muttered, "You'll freeze to stone, girl. Come sit by the stove." She followed him in, boots dripping, and sat near the coals while he poured her weak coffee. He didn't ask questions. She didn't offer answers. But when she stood to leave, he said gently, "That coat's from a good man." She paused. "I figured," she said, eyes soft. And she stepped out again into the pale morning. Back at his cabin, Harlan split wood like he meant to silence something. Each crack of the axe echoed through the trees. He didn't think of her. He told himself that more than once. But when the evening came, he lingered near the town's edge. Not close enough to see her, but close enough to feel something shifting. The snow returned that night. Thicker. Heavier. It blanketed roofs and pressed against windows like it wanted in. And still, Jean stayed. She borrowed a mop from the inn. Helped Deacon Holt carry hymnals. She moved quiet, but people noticed. They always did. "Wearing that coat like she belongs here," Mrs. Maycomb hissed. "She hasn't asked for a dime," Deacon replied. "She hasn't earned it either. She ain't trying to." The town buzzed like hornets under winter glass. On the third day, Harlan passed her on the road. She was kneeling near the livery, brushing ice from a lame dog's fur. The dog whimpered, tail barely twitching. She didn't notice Harlan until he was beside her. She looked up slowly, surprised. He didn't speak. He just bent down, offered a strip of dried meat from his pocket to the dog, and then to her. Jean took it. But not like someone grateful. Like someone who hadn't been offered anything decent in a long while. And then, before she could say thank you, before she could break the moment, he tipped his hat again and walked off into the snow. That night, she stitched the torn inner pocket of his coat with steady fingers. Her hands were raw from cold and soap, but she used the cleanest thread she had. It was all she could offer. Harlan sat by his fireless hearth again. But this time, he did not look at the past. He thought of her hands. Her silence. Her standing still when others would have begged. Snow tapped the windowpane. The kind of snow that doesn't want to melt. The next morning, before the sun crested the ridge, Jean folded the coat carefully and stepped up to Harlan's door. Not the back, not the side, the front, as equals do. She held the coat to her chest like something holy. She knocked once. Harlan opened the door wearing a shirt patched at the shoulders. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she held out the coat. "It's yours," she said. "I mended the pocket." He didn't take it. Instead, he stepped aside, just slightly, just enough. "You cold?" She hesitated. Then, "Not if I'm welcome." And just like that, winter softened. The coat hung by the fire now, drying beside Harlan's boots. Jean hadn't asked to stay. And Harlan hadn't exactly invited her. But once he'd opened the door, he hadn't closed it. That counted for something. She slept on the narrow bench beneath the front window, curled beneath a quilt older than both of them. Harlan offered her the bed once. She declined without shame, only quietness. And so they settled into a rhythm built not on conversation but on presence. The silence between them didn't feel heavy, it felt earned, like a porch that creaked only when you stepped just right. In town, the snow kept falling. By the second day, the horses at the livery wore blankets. By the third, even the saloon cut its hours short. But Jean stayed. She carried water from the pump in a pail too big for her wrists. She dusted shelves she didn't own. She peeled potatoes without being asked. Not to please Harlan. Not to pay rent. But because the hands that had once trembled now wanted to be useful. Harlan watched her work, his thoughts like snowdrifts, quiet but deep. He didn't ask where she came from. He didn't ask who'd hurt her. He noticed, though. The way she winced when she leaned on her left side. The small scar behind her ear. The habit of flinching when someone raised their voice down the road. On the fourth morning, Harlan found her out back kneeling by the woodpile, splitting kindling with a hatchet half her size. "You'll blunt the blade," he said. She didn't stop. "Then you'll have to teach me to sharpen it." He almost smiled. Almost. Later that day, while hammering iron horseshoes in his shed, he heard a sound he hadn't heard in nearly a year. Laughter. Low, startled, unpolished, but unmistakably hers. He peeked around the doorway and saw her kneeling in the snow, a stray chicken perched on her knee like royalty. She was speaking to it as if it were a guest, not a bird. The sight made something shift behind his ribs. Jean noticed him watching. The laughter stopped, but the softness stayed in her eyes. "You've got odd neighbors," she said. "You've got my coat," he replied. She looked down. She still wore it most days, the sleeves rolled and pinned. "I stitched your name into the inside pocket," she said quietly. "Didn't want folks thinking it was mine." He didn't answer, but he remembered that pocket, the one his wife used to hide peppermint candies in every winter. That evening, in town, Mrs. Maycomb's tongue clucked like a metronome. "She's not left," she told the postmaster, folding a letter no one would read. "Still hiding behind that man's fireplace like a barn cat." "Don't bother me none," the postmaster grunted. "She's wearing his coat. Coat ain't a ring. Yet." Evening fell, and gossip crept through town like frost. Paxton Jebbs made a joke in the saloon about widowers and second-hand brides. It earned a few laughs and a few uneasy silences. Folks in cold towns don't like sudden heat. Meanwhile, Jean scrubbed the hearth with vinegar and ash. Harlan didn't ask her to. She just did it between sips of the weak tea he made every night, more habit than hospitality. "I could earn a little coin," she said one evening without looking up. "Sewing. Or cleaning. Or mending. You don't need to." "I want to." He nodded slowly, then added a second log to the fire. A day passed. Then two. On the sixth morning, Jean returned from the chapel with a smile so faint it might have been imagined. "I helped Deacon Holt stitch altar linens," she said, hanging her shawl. "He said I had gentle hands." "You do." She paused mid-motion. "That the first compliment you've given me?" Harlan stirred the stew. "I reckon." She didn't say anything more. But that night, he found the fire still burning when he woke after midnight, and the quilt tucked higher over his shoulders than he remembered. One afternoon, as wind clawed at the corners of the cabin, Jean stepped outside with a tin cup and filled it with melted snow. Harlan followed her out with a shawl he didn't remember owning. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Waiting." "For what?" She looked up at the sky. "For it to let go." He understood. Some days, the cold doesn't settle, it clings. That evening, Harlan brought home a bolt of blue cloth from the general store. Didn't say a word about it. Just left it folded on the chair by the fire. Jean touched it like she wasn't sure it was meant for her. "This for mending?" "For keeping," he said. She didn't thank him with words. Instead, she tore a strip from the edge, hemmed it clean, and tied it around the handle of the teapot, a silent flag of gratitude. That night, town bells rang for Sunday service. Jean rose early and washed her hair in the basin. Braided it tight. Wore her only other dress. When she turned to Harlan, who was cleaning his boots, she said, "Will it cause trouble if I walk in beside you?" He considered her question carefully. "Might cause talk." "Talk's not trouble." "No," he said slowly. "But it's loud." She didn't flinch. "Then let them speak. I'm done apologizing for being." And so they walked side by side through the center of town. Snow falling again, soft as breath. Her boots crunching beside his. No hands held. No words exchanged. But enough was said in the fact of their steps. Inside the chapel, heads turned. Whispers rose and fell like the choir warming up. Deacon Holt raised his brows, then smiled beneath his whiskers. Harlan sat in the pew, not at the back, not hiding. Jean beside him, posture tall. And for the first time since his wife's passing, he bowed his head without thinking of grief. After the sermon, Jean stepped outside first. Harlan stayed a moment longer, speaking with the deacon about horseshoes and fences. But when he emerged, she was still there waiting, not walking ahead, not leaving him behind. "I thought you might," she said, before he could ask. They walked home through snow that wasn't yet deep but lingered around their boots like old promises. When they returned, the cabin felt warmer than it should have. Jean stirred the embers and said, "If I stay, will folks think we're—" She trailed off. He met her eyes. "Let them think." She nodded, but a blush crept up her neck. That night, as wind howled past the shutters, Harlan sat by the fire, whittling a small figurine out of pine. It wasn't anything particular, just a figure standing in snow, shoulders high. Jean watched from her bench. Her voice was almost too soft to hear. "I left Kansas because a man told me he'd marry me, then changed his mind after he got what he wanted." Harlan didn't look up, but the knife slowed. "My father wouldn't let me come home. Said I brought shame." The wood curled in shavings at his feet. "I didn't come here for you," she added. "I came because there was nowhere else." "I know." Silence again. "But now I don't want to leave." This time he did look up. Not startled. Not even moved. Just present. "You don't have to." The fire cracked between them. The snow piled against the door. And for the first time, Jean felt not like a visitor in someone's mercy, but like someone whose footprints were beginning to stay. By the end of the second week, the town stopped calling her the girl at the station and started calling her his. Not to her face, not even cruelly, just in the way towns like Dry Creek do, like it was fact, not rumor. Names get traded for shadows here, and Jean's was the first to be erased. She wore Harlan's old coat still, though the sleeves had been tailored and the stitching neatened. Some days she wore her blue dress too, the one he'd left folded by the fire. She never strutted, never smiled too wide, but her quiet presence filled corners no one else dared claim. At the general store, the gossip swirled between sackflower and coffee beans. "He took her in," someone muttered. "She hasn't left." "And she cooks for him now," another replied. "She's warmed his bed, I'll wager," added Mrs. Maycomb with a sniff, folding bolts of gingham like they offended her fingers. No one said it outright, but the implication hung heavier than the snow outside. A woman without a past. A man with too much of one. And a house lit late into the night. Paxton Jebbs, half-drunk by mid-morning most days, laughed about it in the saloon. Harlan Graves, the grieving blacksmith, let a girl crawl into his hearth and his heart. "Maybe she fixed both," someone said, low. Paxton slammed his mug. "He didn't ask for her. She's got ideas. Proposing herself to him, I heard. Ain't true. Still ain't right. That girl's got secrets stitched under her skin." And just like that, Jean became the town's open secret. Deacon Holt tried to shield her. He spoke kindly, publicly. Let her help fold linens, gave her small errands with dignity. But kindness from a man of the cloth only sharpened the whispers. "A woman doesn't cling to a man's house without intent," someone said. And Harlan's been letting her. In truth, Harlan said little. He kept working his forge behind the cabin. The clang of his hammer echoed like defiance. He repaired wagon wheels, reshaped axes, mended hinges, and when Jean brought him water, he took it with a nod, never a touch. They moved like two people used to carrying shame, careful not to spill each other's. But the town mistook that for intimacy, for secrets exchanged under candlelight. One morning, Jean stopped by the post office. Her name wasn't on the ledger. No mail. No past catching up. Still, Mrs. Maycomb lingered behind her, offering a too-sweet smile. "Thought you'd be gone by now." Jean folded her hands. "Winter's not over." Mrs. Maycomb tilted her head. "Neither is your reputation." Jean didn't answer. Just stepped outside into snow that had begun to fall again, this time softer, steadier. She stood on the porch for a while, letting the wind stitch through her hair like thread. Back at the cabin, she didn't tell Harlan. Not because she was hiding it, but because it didn't matter enough. Let them think what they wanted. She had a bedroll, a cup that was hers, and the feeling of belonging not because she'd earned it, but because she'd stopped apologizing for needing it. That evening, she found a pine wreath on the cabin door. No card. No note. Just branches, shaped by a quiet hand. She left it hanging, though she didn't ask who made it. The next Sunday, she walked into town without him. Harlan had caught a fever and refused to leave his forge, too stubborn to be still. Jean wore her mended shawl and her calm, and stepped into church as if nothing in her life had ever trembled. Deacon Holt saw her first. Nodded once. Mrs. Maycomb scooted closer to the window. "Doesn't seem ashamed," someone whispered. "She should." But Jean sat through the sermon like a stone warmed by sun. She knelt when others knelt, sang only the refrain she knew. She left alone, as snow began again to fall. On her way home, Paxton Jebbs passed her in the street. "You got your hooks in deep, huh?" he said. Jean didn't pause. He spat near her boots. "Man's too proud to see you're just waiting for a ring and a name." She turned. Slowly. "I'm not waiting for either." Her voice was quiet, but it held the weight of all she'd survived. Paxton smirked. "You'll be back at the station come spring." Jean's expression didn't change. "Then you can go back to talking about someone else." And she walked on, snow gathering in the folds of her skirt like it belonged there. That night, Harlan stirred awake in fever-damp sheets and found Jean wiping his forehead with a cool cloth. She didn't flinch when he grumbled or turned away. She didn't ask how he felt. She just stayed, changing the cloth when it warmed. He blinked slowly. "You go to church?" "I did." "Alone?" "Yes." He hesitated. "You wear the coat?" "No." He closed his eyes again. But not before whispering, "Good." Outside, the wind picked up. The pine trees murmured to one another. Inside, Jean shifted the kettle back onto the coals and sat nearby. Harlan's breath evened out, and she leaned back against the chair, watching the flame catch light in the brass hinges of the stove. "Somewhere between midnight and morning," he muttered, half in dream, "they're talkin', aren't they?" She didn't pretend otherwise. "They are." He exhaled. "Let them." Her fingers curled gently around her skirt. "They already are." The next day, she hung new curtains. Blue ones. Sewn from scraps. No one asked her to. No one told her not to. She baked cornbread, burned the first batch, tried again. When Harlan finally managed to sit up, she placed a plate in his lap without comment. He looked at her a long moment. "You stayin'?" Jean didn't smile. Just poured more tea and replied, "I haven't left." That evening, as the sun turned snow to gold, Harlan stepped onto the porch and stood in silence, watching town smoke rise from chimneys down the ridge. Jean joined him, sleeves pushed up, apron dusted in flour. They didn't speak. But when a wagon passed along the road and slowed just enough for the driver to nod, respectful, unsure, wary, Harlan nodded back. The town was still speaking. But now, it was beginning to listen. The snow didn't fall that day, it descended, soft and deliberate, like heaven had taken a breath and exhaled all at once. It covered the rooftops in silence, traced every wooden fence and lace. By mid-morning, the roads vanished. By afternoon, the town was muffled in white. Nothing moved except chimney smoke and the occasional horse's breath pluming into the air. Inside the cabin, the light had a blue hush to it. Jean stood at the window, pressing her palm lightly against the glass. Her breath fogged the pane as she watched the snow stack against the porch rail. Behind her, the fire crackled low, a quiet counterpoint to the storm outside. Harlan was out back. Against her protest, he'd gone to check the barn roof. Stubborn man. Fever-worn still, but unwilling to sit idle while the world he built disappeared beneath drifts. Jean had offered to go instead. He didn't say no. He just laced his boots and didn't answer. She didn't like the way he walked now, slower, leaning slightly left. She'd noticed the limp worsen since the last freeze, but he never acknowledged it. Pride made men foolish. Silence made them proud. When he returned, snow clung to his beard and shoulders. He looked older under the frost. Wearier. "Roof's holding," he muttered, unwrapping his scarf. Jean helped him shed his coat without a word. The muscles in his back flinched as she pulled the sleeves down. She noticed. So did he. "You shouldn't have gone out," she said, soft. "I ain't made of paper." "No," she agreed. "But you're not iron either." He looked at her for a long moment, as though her tenderness unsettled him more than the storm. Then he sat at the table and rubbed the ache from his knee like a man chasing ghosts from bone. Outside, the storm grew teeth. By dusk, the inn had hung a lantern on the porch, its orange glow barely visible through the white. Jean wrapped 2 quilts around the windows, leaving only a sliver of glass. The cabin felt smaller, but safer. Like a secret. Harlan hadn't spoken in over an hour. She brought him tea. He accepted it with a nod, eyes on the fire. "I used to dread snow," he said suddenly. "After Ruth passed. First winter without her. I didn't think it'd end." Jean lowered herself into the chair across from him. "Why?" "Silence was too loud," he said. "And every snowflake felt like it was trying to bury me alongside her." She didn't reply. "Just let the moment settle like ash." "But this one," he continued, voice lower, "this one don't feel like it's burying anything." Jean's hands curled around her cup. Later that night, the fire popped and startled the dog that had made itself a fixture on their porch. Jean stood, opened the door, and let it in without asking. It shook snow all over the floor. Harlan didn't complain. She placed a bowl of broth down, watched it lap quietly. The dog looked up once, and she smiled. "Everyone's looking for warmth, I suppose." "You found it," Harlan said, without looking up. Jean turned. "Did I?" He met her gaze. "You did." There was no romantic swell. No sudden music in the silence. Just 2 people, seated by flame, sharing the weight of having survived. She didn't cry. Instead, she rose, walked over to the wall where his coat still hung, the same coat he'd given her weeks ago, stitched and clean now. She lifted it down and brought it to him. "I want to give this back," she said. He frowned. "I told you it's yours." "It was never mine." She knelt beside him now, the coat folded in her arms like a bundle. "I wore it because I needed something warm. But I don't need it now, not like that." He studied her closely. She swallowed. "You never asked why I stayed." "You didn't need to explain." "I do now." Her voice trembled just once. "I stayed because of that moment when you gave me this and asked for nothing in return. No name. No promise. No story. The room was still. And that's the kind of man I want to share a name with." He blinked. "I'm not asking for romance, Harlan. Not today. I'm asking for a roof and a vow and a way to stop being what everyone else keeps defining me as." She straightened slightly. "I'm asking you to marry me." The fire cracked between them, as if reacting. Outside, the wind howled and then went still. Harlan didn't move. His eyes didn't shift. And yet, everything in him had changed. Jean felt it before he spoke. "I thought I'd buried the part of me that could be chosen again," he said quietly. "But here you are." She nodded once, as if that was all she needed. Still kneeling, she lowered her eyes. He set his mug down gently. "Jean." She looked up. He reached forward, took the coat from her hands, and then, slowly, draped it back over her shoulders. "I'd be honored." A pause. "But not because I pity you. And not because we've both known the ache of being left behind." "Then why?" she asked. His hand hovered over the coat's lapel. "Because you asked before the snow stopped." And outside, for the first time in hours, the wind quieted. The snow began to ease. The storm was ending. But something else had just begun. By morning, the storm had spent itself. The sky broke open in pale gold and soft gray, and the snow no longer fell, it shimmered. The world was hushed, heavy with white and wonder, as if heaven had stepped closer in the night and left its fingerprints on every rooftop. Smoke curled slowly from Harlan's chimney, rising straight and untroubled. Inside the cabin, the silence was not empty, it was reverent. Jean stood by the window, barefoot on the wood planks, wrapped in the very coat she'd once tried to return. She didn't need it now, not for warmth, but for memory. The fire beside her had burned low. Her breath made soft clouds on the glass as she watched the world reappear under melting snow. Behind her, Harlan stirred. He moved slower these days, but not from pain, from consideration. His limp remained, but it no longer made him smaller. His shoulders were straight this morning. Something had settled in him. Not peace, not yet, but something close. She turned as he entered the room, already half-buttoned into his shirt. "You sure?" he asked her, like he needed to say it one more time, not out of doubt but respect. Jean met his eyes. "I wouldn't have asked if I wasn't." He nodded once, firm. Then, as if on instinct, he took her hand, not possessively, but openly, like someone claiming nothing but presence. She didn't pull away. By noon, the snow had softened enough for boots to find the road. They walked to the chapel together, just as they had weeks ago, but this time no one whispered when they passed. Or if they did, the wind kept their voices buried. The town was quiet, stilled by weather, or perhaps by the weight of what they'd watched unfold. Not everyone came to the wedding. But those who mattered did. Deacon Holt waited by the chapel door, pipe tucked in his coat pocket, his Bible held like a promise. His wife had lit candles in the windows, and their soft flicker danced across the wooden pews like fireflies. Mrs. Maycomb was already seated in the back, lips tight, hands folded, wearing judgment like perfume. But she said nothing as Jean entered. She simply stared. Jean wore her blue dress, the one stitched from a bolt Harlan had brought home without a word. She had mended it carefully, added lace along the cuffs. In her hands she held no flowers, only the hem of her courage. Harlan stood at the front, his suspenders straight, hair combed back with a trembling hand. He wore his late wife's wedding ring on a ribbon around his neck, tucked beneath his shirt. Today it would remain there. The ceremony was brief. No music. No rehearsal. No fuss. Just two people who had endured what others hadn't, standing before a flame that had outlived the storm. The deacon's voice was steady, quiet enough that it didn't interrupt the hush in the room but strong enough to be remembered. When he asked who gave the bride, Jean answered herself. When he asked for vows, Harlan said simply, "I will do my best, every day, even when I fail." Jean nodded. "Then I will stand with you, even when I fall." And that was enough. Deacon Holt didn't ask for a kiss. He just closed the Bible, smiled like someone watching spring arrive, and said, "Well then." As they turned to leave, Paxton Jebb stood at the back of the church, arms crossed. He'd come late, halfway through, but just in time for spectacle. He spat on the floorboards. "A widow marrying a charity case. Guess the West ain't got no shame left." The room tensed. Harlan paused in the aisle. The old coat draped over Jean's shoulders, the hem brushing her boots like a memory. She reached for his hand, not to hold him back, but to steady him. But Harlan didn't lunge. Didn't bark. He simply turned to Paxton and said, voice even, "A woman who survives what she wasn't meant to, that's not charity." "She's used," Paxton snapped. "A man marries a used woman, he begs for pity." Harlan stepped forward once, slow. The light from the stained glass window caught the side of his face. "I didn't marry her because she needed saving. I married her because she saved me." Paxton opened his mouth, but nothing came. The deacon laid a hand on his shoulder. "Son," he said, "you're in God's house. Might be a good time to listen." Paxton scoffed, shoved the door open, and disappeared into the bright snow. No one followed. Outside, the sky had turned brilliant. The wind had stopped altogether. It was the kind of weather that only came after the worst of it had passed. Jean stepped onto the church steps, blinked at the sunlight. Harlan followed, paused beside her. Below the chapel, the town stood still. Women at their windows. Men at fences. Children with snow in their mittens, watching. Someone cheered. Not loud, not rowdy, just one of the little ones who'd seen Jean help deliver a calf the week before. She smiled. Harlan raised her hand slightly in his. The gesture was simple, quiet. But it shifted the weight of the town. They walked down the hill together. The same road that had once swallowed her footprints now kept them pressed deep in the snow side by side. Back at the cabin, the fire had kept itself alive. Jean set bread to warm. Harlan unbuttoned his cuffs. The dog thumped its tail against the floorboards. She turned once more at the door and looked outside. The trees shimmered in the light. The wind didn't whisper anymore. Will they still talk? She asked. He stood behind her, slipped the coat from her shoulders, hung it beside the door. They might, he said. But let 'em talk about the day the storm broke. She smiled then. Not wide. Not loud. Just enough. And as they stepped inside, married, steady, unfinished, they left the door ajar just long enough for the warmth to spill out. There are storms that take. And storms that reveal what never blew away. This was the kind that left something standing.